Sleep Stories, Men in Black Alien and UFO Encounters for Sleep, Episode 1. https YouTube QPPerpiga KKPU C 2 HWXF1DM KGA CPX8. Welcome back to Dreams of Disclosure. Tonight we step into the shadowy world of the Men in Black, the watchers who appear when UFO encounters cross a line. They arrive without warning, at your door, in the hallway, beside a parked car. Black suits, sharp hats, polished shoes, pale faces, and eyes that seem to look straight through you. They come after the lights in the sky, the strange craft, the evidence you thought no one else knew about. And when they leave, so does your certainty. For decades, the same unsettling story repeats. Government agents, or something far stranger wearing a human form. Before we begin, who do you think they are? Please leave a comment below. Now, let the stories begin. Herbert Hopkins, The Old Orchard Beach Visit, 1976. Old Orchard Beach, Maine, USA. It was a quiet evening in 1976 when Dr. Herbert Hopkins, a respected doctor in Old Orchard Beach, Maine, and part-time advisor for a local UFO investigation, received an unexpected phone call. Hopkins was alone at home reviewing notes at his desk. A small stack of neatly organized papers sat nearby, all related to the case he was helping with. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, and precise. The caller introduced himself as a fellow UFO researcher and said he wished to discuss the very case Hopkins was working on. There was no demand, no urgency in his tone, only the clear suggestion that this was important and should happen that evening. Hopkins agreed, setting the phone down with only a passing thought about the short notice. Within minutes, there was a knock at the door. Standing there was a man unlike anyone Hopkins had ever met, thin to the point of weakness, skin so pale it carried no hint of natural color. His perfectly tailored black suit fit without a crease, and a derby hat shaded his face. When he stepped inside at Hopkins's invitation, the light revealed details that Hopkins would never forget. Skin that looked almost waxy, stretched evenly as if poured over bone. Lips a bright, unnatural shade of red. So sharply defined they looked painted on. The man's movements were precise, smooth, and missing the small natural shifts that make most people seem alive. Hopkins, trained to notice even the smallest human signals, felt unsettled by the absence of them. They sat in the living room. The visitor wasted no time on small talk. His questions were direct, as if he already knew the outline of the UFO case and was simply confirming details. He wanted to know about the witnesses, the physical evidence, and how and where it had been stored. Hopkins noticed that throughout the exchange, the man never once broke eye contact. Midway through, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small coin. He rolled it slowly between his fingers, the movement careful. Hopkins's eyes stayed on it, and then, without a flick or flourish, the coin began to fade. Its edges blurred, its shine dulled, and within moments it seemed to dissolve completely, leaving nothing between the man's fingertips. "You will stop your work on this case," the man said. His tone carried no threat, no rise or fall, only a flat statement with finality. He asked a few more questions, repeating the same topics. The questions seemed designed to test Hopkins' consistency. As the conversation went on, the man's behavior changed. His speech slowed, each sentence broken by pauses. His movements grew stiff, almost robotic. Finally, he said, "My energy is running low. I must leave." He rose, adjusted his derby hat with care, and walked to the door. Hopkins followed him onto the porch. The man stepped down the stairs and moved into the darkness. No headlights appeared, no car door closed, and Hopkins heard no sound of an engine. That night, Hopkins acted without hesitation. He went to his office and destroyed every UFO research file in his possession. The case notes, the photographs, the transcripts, all gone before morning. The change in Hopkins' behavior was immediate. In the days that followed, calls from other investigators went unanswered. When one colleague managed to reach him, Hopkins' voice was flat, his replies short. "I'm stepping away from that work," he said. No explanation. A fellow researcher from out of state who had been scheduled to visit received a polite but firm cancellation. "Circumstances have changed," Hopkins told him. Locally, the change was noticed in quieter ways. A librarian at the Old Orchard Beach Historical Society recalled how Hopkins, who had been requesting materials on unusual aerial sightings, suddenly stopped. "One week he was calling every couple of days," she said, "and then nothing. It was like a door closed." Even neighbors saw a difference. One remarked to a friend that Hopkins seemed more private after that week. The curtains in his home were drawn more often, and the porch light, once left on into the evening, was dark. Word of the incident did not spread through headlines, but through letters, phone calls, and small gatherings of UFO investigators. The story's details were passed carefully, sometimes altered in minor ways, but the central image stayed the same. A pale man in a black suit, arriving within minutes of a phone call, performing an impossible act with a coin, and leaving behind an empty resolve where an active investigation had been. Speculation followed quickly. Some suggested the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, pointing to its history of interviewing and sometimes discouraging UFO witnesses. Others considered the FBI, citing its occasional surveillance of civilian researchers in the past decade. But many, perhaps most, saw it as one of the clearest examples of a Men in Black encounter, noting the precision of the visit and the complete end of Hopkins's work. Months later, at a small conference in New England, a speaker mentioned the case without naming Hopkins directly. Those who knew the details exchanged glances. The hint was enough. By the end of the month, Hopkins had removed himself from all UFO-related correspondence. When an old acquaintance in the field stopped by his office unannounced, Hopkins greeted him warmly but refused to discuss the case. "It's closed," he said, and changed the topic to fishing, weather, and local news. Friends noticed other changes too. Hopkins no longer attended evening gatherings where local enthusiasts shared stories. His interest in unusual topics was gone. One former colleague put it simply, "The man I knew was curious even about the strangest claims. After that night, that curiosity was gone." In the years that followed, the Herbert Hopkins case became a quiet but lasting part of Men in Black lore, cited in books, mentioned in lectures, and debated in small circles. Its strength lay not in physical evidence, but in its sharpness. A lone man, a brief visit, a single unexplainable demonstration, and the complete silencing of a willing researcher. Hopkins himself never publicly added more than the original account. When asked in later years, he would only say, "It happened exactly as I said it did. I've said all I need to say." For those who study the Men in Black, it stands as one of the rare cases where the purpose of the visit was achieved without threats or force. The files were gone, the work abandoned, and the witness stepped away, all within a single evening. Maury Island Incident, June 1947, Puget Sound, Washington, USA. The morning was calm over Puget Sound in June 1947. Harold Dahl was out on his small patrol boat with his son, the family dog, and 2 crewmen when 6 metallic discs appeared overhead. They moved in a slow, tight formation. One faltered. It tilted and dropped a spray of molten debris. Fragments hissed into the water. Others struck the boat. One piece burned Dahl's son. another killed the dog. Dahl steered clear as the formation regrouped and slipped west into the haze. He kept a few shards from the deck, some light and brittle, others disturbingly heavy. Back on shore, he told only a small circle, his boss, Fred Krisman, and 2 close friends. Dahl had no interest in making the story public. He hadn't even told his wife. But by the next morning, something felt wrong. A call came to his home from a man he didn't know. The voice was polite but firm, leaving no room for refusal. The caller suggested they meet for breakfast at a diner in Tacoma and gave the place and time before Dahl could respond. When he walked into the diner, the man was already there, seated in a booth near the back. He wore a black suit, crisp white shirt, and narrow black tie. His hat rested neatly on the seat beside him. Dahl slid into the booth opposite. The man didn't offer a name, didn't shake hands. He simply looked at Dahl with a steady, unblinking gaze and began to speak. "You had quite an experience out there on the water," he said, his voice low and measured. Then he described it. The number of craft, the one that wobbled, the spray of debris, the injury to Dahl's son, the death of the dog. Every detail was exact. Dahl sat in silence, listening, wondering how the man could possibly know. At one point, the man leaned in slightly. "It would be better," he said, "for you and your family if you forget what you saw." There was no threat in his tone, no visible anger. But there was weight behind the words, as though the outcome was already decided. Dahl noticed the man's face was pale, his features sharp, but oddly flat, like someone used to hiding expression. His speech was careful, almost practiced. The conversation was short, no more than 15 minutes. And when it was over, the man stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. He didn't pay for his coffee. Through the diner's front window, Dahl watched him step into a black sedan parked at the curb. The car pulled away into the light morning traffic and was gone. That meeting left a mark Dahl couldn't shake. He felt the man hadn't been trying to persuade him of anything, just giving an order and making sure he understood. That night, Dahl barely slept. He kept replaying the moment when the man described the injury to his son. It wasn't just that he knew. It was how casually he said it, as if the knowledge itself was ordinary. In the days that followed, Dahl avoided talking about the sighting. When a local reporter approached him after hearing rumors of strange discs over the sound, Dahl shrugged it off as a mistake or misreading. Within a week, he publicly took back his account entirely, but the story had already spread further than he wanted. Krisman, still convinced something strange had happened, wrote to a contact in the Army Air Forces describing the incident and offering to show the debris. Soon, 2 intelligence officers, Captain William Davidson and Lieutenant Frank Brown, flew up from Hamilton Field in California to speak with both men. The officers interviewed Dahl in detail, asking for exact times, positions, and descriptions of the objects. They examined the boat's damage and took samples of the debris, noting in their reports that some of the material had a slag-like texture, unlike common metals. They also wrote down differences in Dahl's account, changes in the order of events, uncertainty about distances. Whether those differences came from real confusion or from Dahl's reluctance to talk, they couldn't tell. When the interviews were over, Davidson and Brown boarded their B-25 bomber for the flight back to California, carrying the debris samples with them. Somewhere near Kelso, Washington, the plane caught fire and crashed. Both men were killed. The debris was destroyed in the blaze. News of the crash spread quickly through military channels, but the public was told it was a tragic accident. no mention was made of what the officers had been carrying. For Da, the event only reinforced his decision to stay silent. He had been told clearly to forget what he saw, and now 2 men were dead. In private, he told a friend that the meeting at the diner had felt less like a conversation and more like being brought into something he didn't want to be part of. The Air Force eventually issued a statement calling the Maury Island case a hoax, citing Dahl's own retraction. But the timeline, a sighting, a strange visit, a reluctant witness, and the unexplained loss of physical evidence didn't sit right with everyone. Over the years, the story became part of the early foundation of Men in Black lore. Researchers pointed to the quiet precision of the visit, the way the man seemed less concerned with details of the sighting than with Dahl's willingness to talk about it. They noted that he had appeared without ID, without a name, yet with total control of the conversation. In later decades, similar reports would emerge, witnesses describing unexpected visits from men in black suits who knew details they couldn't have learned normally, who gave instructions without open threats, and who left behind more questions than answers. The Maury Island incident became the earliest known example of that pattern. For Harold Dahl, the discs over the sound may have been extraordinary, but they were brief, a matter of minutes in an otherwise ordinary day. The man in the diner was different. He had been deliberate, present, unavoidable. If the discs were the mystery, the man was the consequence. And in the years that followed, in story after story, that consequence would appear again and again. A knock at the door, a black car waiting outside, and someone who already knew exactly what you had seen. The Robert Richardson Incident, July 1967, Toledo, Ohio, USA. On a warm July 1967 night, just after midnight, 19-year-old University of Toledo student Robert Richardson was driving home along a dim, quiet road. A metallic flash appeared in his headlights, and a second later, his bumper struck it with a sharp jolt. He checked the car, pulled over, and stepped out. The road was empty, silent, except for his cooling engine. A few steps back, he found a small silvery fragment, light, metallic, and oddly cool to the touch. He slipped it into his pocket and drove on. The next day, he told a local UFO research group he sometimes contacted. They urged him to keep it safe for testing. Richardson placed it in a bedroom drawer, deciding it could wait. 2 days later, there was a knock at the front door. When Richardson opened it, 2 men were standing on the porch. They were tall, dressed in dark suits despite the July heat, with narrow ties and crisp white shirts. One looked to be in his late 30s, the other older, maybe in his 50s, both pale and expressionless. The older man spoke first. "Mr. Richardson, you have something that does not belong to you." Richardson, caught off guard, asked them to explain. "You took a piece of metal from the scene of an incident," the man replied, his tone flat, almost mechanical. Richardson denied it at first, unsure of who they were or how they might react. The younger man stepped forward slightly. Pulling from his jacket a notepad with an address, Richardson's, and a series of numbers he recognized as his driver's license and university ID. "We know where you are. We know what you have," the older man continued. "You will give it to us." When Richardson asked for identification, the men ignored him. They did not claim to be police or any branch of government. Instead, the younger one simply said, "It is important for your safety that you comply." Their presence had a weight to it, as if they held authority without needing to prove it. The conversation was brief, no more than 5 minutes. When Richardson told them the piece had already been sent away for testing, which was true, the older man's expression didn't change. But he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "If you are lying, it will be worse for you." Without another word, they turned together and walked to a black 1963 Cadillac sedan parked at the curb. The car pulled away without engine noise reaching his ears, disappearing into the next block. If Richardson thought that would be the end of it, he was wrong. 3 nights later, around 9 p.m., there was another knock. This time, it was just one man, younger than either of the first pair, wearing the same kind of dark suit, but with a pale gray fedora pulled low over his brow. His skin, Richardson later said, had the oddest texture, like it was too smooth. The man's tone was less formal, more casual. But the message was the same. The fragment must be returned. When Richardson repeated that it was no longer with him, the man smiled faintly and said, "You will retrieve it." Then he stepped closer and asked a question Richardson would remember for the rest of his life. "How would you like it if we harmed someone close to you? Your wife, perhaps?" Richardson wasn't married, but he had been dating a woman steadily for months. The man named her first and last name and recited her address. Then, as if he hadn't just made a threat, he tipped his hat slightly and walked away. From that night on, Richardson's sense of safety changed. The fragment was already out of his reach. The UFO group had given it to a researcher for testing. But the men's knowledge of his life, their exact details, stayed with him. He began noticing the same black Cadillac parked on streets near his apartment. Sometimes it would idle at a distance when he walked to his car. Other times it was just far enough away to make him unsure if it was watching him at all. The more he noticed, the more he realized that even simple errands, going to the grocery store, visiting the library, seemed to be shadowed. A man in a suit at the magazine rack. Another in the corner booth of a diner, always reading a newspaper but never turning the pages. Richardson told only a few people about the encounters. One was a physics professor at the university who had some interest in UFO reports. The professor, instead of laughing it off, told him bluntly, "If those men are what I think they are, you don't want to test their patience." Despite the threats, Richardson never went to the police. In 1967, the idea of walking into a Toledo precinct and saying, "Two men in black suits threaten me over a UFO fragment," seemed like an invitation to be dismissed. Or worse, to draw the attention of the very agencies he suspected were behind the visits. Privately, though, some people in the local UFO research community began whispering that Richardson's case matched a troubling pattern. The NICAP, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, files had several similar reports. Physical trace UFO cases where a witness picked up material, only for unidentified men, often assumed to be connected to the Air Force's OSI or another federal office, to appear and take it back. In most of those cases, the material was never seen again. When the test results from Richardson's fragment finally came back, they were inconclusive. The lab noted unusual structural properties, but stopped short of calling it extraterrestrial. Before a second round of tests could be done, the fragment vanished from the researcher's possession under circumstances never fully explained. Richardson's contact with the men in black ended as suddenly as it began. One day, the car was gone. The strangers stopped appearing, and life went back to looking normal on the outside. But the feeling of being watched, of being open to forces beyond the reach of law or reason, never left him. In later years, when interviewed by UFO authors, Richardson was careful with his words. He never claimed the men were aliens, nor that the fragment was definitely from another world. What he stressed instead was their manner, controlled, clinical, without emotion, and their knowledge, which seemed to come from a source beyond normal surveillance. His story became part of the larger Men in Black mystery. Researchers saw it as another case where the goal wasn't to deny the event, but to take away anything physical that could prove it happened. Today, the Robert Richardson incident is remembered less for the quick UFO sighting and more for what came after. It became a classic example in MIB history, a case where a physical object was recovered from a UFO encounter, followed by a fast and precise response from unidentified agents. The intimidation went beyond Richardson himself to those close to him, and in the end, the possible evidence was quietly taken out of public reach. Richardson once said, "If they wanted the piece, they could have taken it from me that night. Coming back twice was about something else. They wanted me to remember them." For many who study the phenomenon, that is the lasting power of Men in Black encounters. The artifact may vanish and the details of the sighting may fade, but the deliberate disruption of a witness's life leaves a mark that decades cannot erase. The Jack Robinson Surveillance Case. Spring 1968, Jersey City, New Jersey, USA. Early spring in Jersey City in 1968, Mary Robinson stepped out of her apartment building. She was on her way to work, coat pulled tight against the morning chill, when she noticed something odd. Across the street, parked at the curb, was a black sedan. A man sat behind the wheel, dressed in a dark suit, white shirt, and black tie. His face was pale, his features sharp, but strangely blank, as if his expression had been set hours earlier and never changed. He was staring directly at her. At first, she thought it might be a coincidence. Someone waiting for a friend, maybe a neighbor getting a ride. But the man didn't look away when she glanced at him, and he didn't move at all. His eyes followed her as she walked toward the corner. Even when she turned down the block, she felt strongly that he was still watching. Mary's husband, Jack Robinson, was no stranger to odd attention. A respected figure in the New Jersey branch of the UFO research community, he had spent years quietly gathering reports, interviewing witnesses, and sending findings to national organizations. But in recent months, he had been looking into a series of close encounter reports that hinted at unusual activity in the area. The night before, Jack had mentioned to Mary that he felt someone had been in their apartment while they were out. Papers on his desk had been moved, a drawer slightly open that he swore he had closed. Nothing was missing, but the disorder seemed too intentional to be an accident. He had brushed it off as maybe his own carelessness. But now, seeing the man in the car, Mary felt her unease sharpen. She didn't tell Jack immediately. Instead, she noted the time, just after 8 a.m., and the license plate number, though the sequence seemed strangely forgettable, slipping from her thoughts minutes later. That evening, when she came home, she asked Jack if anyone had contacted him recently about his work. He frowned, shook his head, and asked why. Mary told him about the man in the car. Jack listened without interrupting, his face tightening as she described the suit and the unblinking stare. By the time she finished, he was already thinking about who in their circle might quietly confirm whether they were being watched. The next morning, the man was there again. Same car, same position, same posture. This time, Mary saw him adjust something in his lap. A notebook, perhaps, or a small device. But his gaze never left the front of their building. By the third day, Mary told Jack she was sure it wasn't random. She urged him to call someone. Jack decided to reach out to a friend, fellow UFO researcher Timothy Green Beckley, a man known for chasing down leads others avoided. When Beckley heard the story, he didn't hesitate. He told Jack and Mary to stay put and went straight to another contact, photographer Jim Mosley, who shared their interest in documenting the edges of the UFO mystery. If the man was there the next morning, Beckley and Mosley would see for themselves. Day 4 began the same way. Pale sunlight, cool air, and the black sedan parked across from the Robinsons' apartment. The man inside looked exactly as Mary had described. Dark suit, hat pulled low, white shirt buttoned high, the kind of neatness that seemed almost staged. Beckley and Mosley parked half a block away and approached on foot, keeping their pace casual. As they drew closer, Beckley noticed the man's stillness. No fidgeting, no signs of impatience, as though he could sit there endlessly. His gaze stayed locked on the Robinsons' building, even as the two men walked past him. Mosley, with his camera ready, slowed enough to take a single quick photograph. The man didn't react. The click of the shutter, the closeness of strangers, none of it seemed to matter. Beckley later described it as like taking a picture of a mannequin that happened to be breathing. That photograph would become one of the most shared images in Men in Black lore. A grainy black and white showing the man in the sedan, hat casting a shadow over his eyes, his mouth set in a line that was neither a frown nor a smile. Inside their apartment, Jack and Mary were relieved to have proof. It wasn't just in their heads. Someone was watching them. The question was, who and why? Jack's work in UFO research was not classified, nor did it look dangerous to any agency on the surface. He collected reports, chased rumors, and sometimes published in small newsletters. But lately, he had been speaking with witnesses whose accounts hinted at physical trace evidence, ground marks, strange residue, even recovered objects. If those claims were real, they could have drawn the wrong kind of attention. The Robinsons began to wonder if the man in the black sedan might be tied to a government group, the FBI perhaps, or even the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, both known to have monitored UFO cases before. If so, his presence outside their home might not have been idle curiosity, but official surveillance. That thought was no comfort. It meant the man could sit there day after day with an authority they could not confirm or challenge. Mary began to notice other things. Twice, when she came home from errands, she was sure the apartment door's lock felt different, as though it had been forced or handled roughly. Once, she found that a small jewelry box on her dresser had been moved exactly 2 inches from where she had left it. Nothing was missing, but the careful disturbance was unsettling. Jack's papers were another concern. A few pages of his latest case notes seemed to have been copied. He noticed the originals stacked out of order and the edges of some pages slightly curled, as if touched by damp fingers. He couldn't prove it, but the pattern was getting harder to dismiss. Observation outside, intrusion inside. By the end of the first week, the man in the car was no longer the only sign of surveillance. Jack began spotting a second figure, another man in a similar dark suit, standing in the lobby of their building at odd hours, never speaking. Always gone by the time Jack returned with company. Neighbors began asking questions. One woman down the hall mentioned the government guy in the car. Another tenant told Mary he had seen 2 men in suits walking slowly down the hallway outside their apartment late one night. They didn't knock, didn't speak, just walked, stopped outside the Robinsons' door, then left. The tension grew in small, steady ways. Jack found himself checking the street before leaving. Mary began closing the curtains in the daytime, uneasy about unseen eyes. Even their phone calls started to feel off, occasional clicks on the line, brief static. When Beckley returned a week later, the car was still there. He and Mosley decided to try a more direct approach. They walked past the sedan again, slower this time. Beckley looked straight at the man and said, "Morning." The man didn't blink. He didn't acknowledge the greeting at all. His head stayed perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the building. Beckley later said the lack of reaction was more disturbing than any open threat. By the 10th day, the black sedan was gone. No explanation, no sign of the man, and no other clear watchers. Life in the Robinsons' apartment went back to normal routines, but the absence didn't erase what had happened. Jack continued his research, but more carefully. He locked his notes in a metal file cabinet, kept sensitive material out of the apartment when possible, and told fewer people about the details of his work. Mary, for her part, never forgot the face in the car window or the way his stare made the air feel heavier. When the photograph taken by Mosley began spreading among UFO researchers, it sparked debate. Some argued the man could have been a private investigator or a low-level government agent assigned to monitor Jack's activities. Others saw the image as proof of something stranger, a real men in black caught in daylight. Their methods laid bare in the simplest way: watching, waiting, and leaving without a trace. In later years, the Robinson case would be cited in conferences and books as one of the clearest visual records of MIB surveillance. The image became a reference point, not because it proved the existence of the men in black beyond doubt, but because it fit so neatly into the accounts of dozens of other witnesses who described the same quiet, deliberate monitoring. For Jack and Mary, the meaning was less about public proof and more about personal intrusion. The man in the car had never knocked on their door, never spoken, never made a direct threat, yet his presence had changed the way they lived, even if only for a short time. It was a reminder that being watched did not require confrontation, and that sometimes the most effective pressure was the kind that left nothing physical behind, except in this rare case, a single photograph, and the memory of a man who sat in silence day after day for reasons he never explained. The Paul Miller case, Minot, North Dakota, 1961. 1961, Minot, North Dakota, USA. The night over North Dakota in 1961 was cold and still, the kind that swallowed sound. Paul Miller, a young Air Force reservist, was returning from a hunting trip with 3 companions when something strange cut across the dark. They saw it only briefly, a glowing object hovering low in a nearby field. 2 figures came out of it, moving oddly toward a fence line. Miller, on instinct, raised his rifle and fired. The next thing they knew, they were back in the car, heading toward Minot Air Force Base. Their watches showed hours had passed, but none of them could remember leaving the field. No report was filed. None of them wanted to be the one to explain it to their superiors. The 4 men made a silent agreement to keep it to themselves, knowing that anything unusual discussed too openly on base could quickly turn into an issue involving intelligence officers from the Office of Special Investigations, OSI, or another federal branch. The next morning, Miller was at his desk when the call came through. "Stay where you are. Visitors are on their way." The words were spoken with a quiet authority that left no room for questions. 2 men arrived within the hour. They were dressed the same: dark suits, white shirts, and narrow black ties. Their faces were pale, their expressions nearly blank. Without greeting, one of them said in a flat voice, "Mr. Miller, you had an encounter last night." The wording made Miller pause. He hadn't told anyone on base. "I don't know what you mean," he replied. The second man placed a folder on the desk. Inside was a typed sheet, his name, address, family members, even his service history down to the name of his elementary school. Miller stared at it, then looked up. "You shot at something you shouldn't have," the first man said. Miller felt his chest tighten. "Who told you that?" Neither man answered. Instead, one leaned closer, his voice low but flat. "We know what you saw. and we know where you live. It would be best if you forgot about last night." When Miller asked who they were with, the reply came quickly. "That's not important." The meeting lasted no more than 10 minutes. They left as suddenly as they had arrived. From his office window, Miller watched them walk in perfect step to a black sedan parked at the far end of the lot. It was in a section of the base usually reserved for official vehicles, the kind often used by OSI agents or visiting Department of Defense staff, and no one questioned its presence. The car pulled away without making a sound he could hear. That evening, Miller checked every lock on his doors twice. He kept the rifle within arm's reach. Over the following days, he noticed a black car parked along the road to his home at odd hours. Once, through the curtain, he saw a man sitting in the driver's seat, facing forward, wearing dark sunglasses despite the gray sky. His hunting companions began reporting similar experiences, a strange car trailing them for a few blocks, men in suits standing across from their homes and disappearing when approached. None of them had spoken openly about the encounter. Yet the watchful eyes were real. On base, Miller began to feel conversation stop when he entered a room. A colleague in uniform once asked if someone from higher up had contacted him, then quickly changed the subject. He noticed two unknown men in civilian clothes standing near the mess hall one afternoon, watching him as he passed. They didn't speak, only followed him with their eyes until he was gone. The effect on his mind was slow and draining. He became overly alert to his surroundings, checking mirrors, pausing before unlocking his front door, scanning parked cars as he walked to work. Even small noises, a phone ringing, footsteps in the corridor, sometimes made him tense, waiting for another knock on the door, another unwanted visit. His family noticed the change. He spoke less at dinner, stayed up later at night, sometimes staring out the window for long stretches. When his wife asked what was wrong, he would say nothing, but she could tell it was more than tiredness. The base community was small, and word traveled even without official channels. While no one confronted him directly, Miller sensed his name had been linked to something unusual. One mechanic he knew well avoided eye contact for weeks. Another colleague quietly warned him, "Be careful who you talk to." Weeks passed, then months. The surveillance faded, but the memory of it didn't. Miller left the Air Force Reserve a few years later, but the incident stayed with him. When in the late 1960s and early 70s researchers began documenting patterns in so-called men in black visits, Miller recognized the descriptions instantly: the stiff formality, the strange knowledge, the quiet but heavy intimidation. It wasn't until the late 1970s that Miller agreed to share the story in detail with a UFO researcher. Even then, he hesitated, afraid that speaking about it might bring them back. He admitted that for years after the visit, he had nightmares of returning to his office and finding the two men already sitting there, waiting. By the time the account entered UFO literature, the original sighting had become almost secondary. The focus was on the precision and speed of the response, the way they had arrived within hours, armed with personal and military background, and issued a warning without any official acknowledgement. Researchers who examined the case pointed out the unusual level of coordination. If the men were from a known military or intelligence agency, OSI, Air Force Intelligence, or even the CIA, they should have identified themselves. Yet they hadn't. If they weren't, how had they gained such quick access to Miller's service file and movements? And if their goal was to silence him, why had they made their presence so obvious? Miller didn't dwell on the larger theories. For him, the experience wasn't a research problem, but a memory that stayed sharp in all the wrong ways. He remembered the slight delay before each man spoke, as if they were following an inner rhythm. He remembered how their footsteps matched perfectly when they turned to leave, how their shoulders never shifted, how not a strand of hair seemed out of place. Even decades later, when Miller was well into middle age, he kept his telling of the story brief. He sometimes ended it by saying, "It was the quiet that got to me. They didn't have to yell. They already knew I'd remember every word." Among those who heard him speak, the impact was strong. In small UFO groups and private letters, his case was cited as one of the clearest examples of MIB behavior, without theatrics, built entirely on controlled presence and the weight of implied authority. Some listeners admitted that it wasn't the warning itself that disturbed them, but the idea that such an encounter could happen so quickly, without explanation, and then fade back into daily life as though it had never happened. That, perhaps, was the most lasting part of the Paul Miller case. It showed that whatever the men in black were, government agents, something stranger or something in between, their power was not in force, but in certainty. They arrived when they wished, said what they wanted to say, and left without asking permission. And for those on the receiving end, the silence afterward was never empty. It was a waiting space filled with the knowledge that if the door opened again, it wouldn't be by chance. Albert K. Bender, The Bridgeport Encounters, 1953, Bridgeport, Connecticut, USA. In 1953, another case surfaced. This time it happened in the industrial city of Bridgeport, Connecticut. Albert K. Bender was not a casual witness. He was the founder of the International Flying Saucer Bureau, a small but growing network of enthusiasts trading sightings, theories, and clippings by mail. His top-floor apartment at 784 Broad Street doubled as the Bureau's headquarters, each surface crowded with files and correspondence. That summer, Bender had been preparing an issue of Space Review, the Bureau's bulletin. In it, he hinted that the UFO mystery had been solved, a conclusion he intended to reveal in the next issue. Before that could happen, something changed. It began with a strange heaviness in the air when he worked at his desk at night. Sometimes a faint smell, like sulfur or ozone, would drift in. His thoughts would blur. A pressure would build behind his eyes. One evening in late July, the sensation came on stronger than ever. He was alone in the apartment. The clock on the wall ticked past 9 when the air seemed to drop a few degrees. The light from the desk lamp dimmed, though the bulb did not flicker. Then he knew he wasn't alone. 3 men stood in the room. He had not heard the door. They were dressed the same. Black suits, black hats, narrow black ties, crisp white shirts. Their skin was pale, almost gray, and their eyes, he would later say, had a strange glowing quality, as though light came from within. They did not sit. They did not remove their hats. One of them, taller than the rest, spoke in a low, flat voice that carried no clear accent. They told him they knew he had been collecting information on flying saucers. They told him to stop. Bender sat frozen, his hands on his knees. He could not recall them threatening him directly, but the message was final. His mouth felt dry, and when he tried to speak, no sound came out. One of the men stepped closer. Bender noticed a metallic shine at the man's wrist. Not a watch, but something smooth and curved, half hidden under the cuff. He could not identify it. A wave of dizziness swept over him. For a moment, his vision blurred. When it cleared, the men were gone. The days after the visit passed in a kind of fog. His headaches worsened. He lost track of time. Letters from bureau members went unanswered. He found himself leaving the office early, walking aimlessly through the city. Then, in early September, they came again. This time, Bender had been lying down trying to fight off one of the headaches. When the air thickened, the same smell, sulfur, sharp and faintly metallic, seeped in. He opened his eyes to see the three men standing at the foot of the bed. They didn't repeat their warning. Instead, they let him know without long words that he was close to the truth. He would later insist they communicated partly in words and partly in thoughts that appeared fully formed in his mind. One of them pulled out a small circular object from inside his jacket. Its surface seemed to move in the light like liquid metal. Bender felt a sudden chill, followed by the sense that the room was pulling away. He could hear them, but the words were muffled, as if coming from another floor. Then he blacked out. When he woke, the room was empty. Hours had passed. Within a week, he made his decision. Bender closed the International Flying Saucer Bureau. In the October issue of Space Review, he printed a short notice. The mystery of the flying saucers is no longer a mystery. The source is known, but any information about this is being withheld by order from a higher source. No further explanation appeared. There was no next issue. To his members, it made no sense. The Bureau had been active and ambitious. Its network had grown to multiple countries. Now it had stopped overnight without a clear reason. Bender gave no details in public. In private, he told a few correspondents about the visits, but never named the men. He would not speak openly until years later. When he finally published his account in 1962 in the book Flying Saucers and the Three Men, the details were as strange as the silence had suggested. He described the three visitors not just as men in black suits, but as beings who could appear and vanish at will, whose presence was marked by an unnatural cold and a sharp smell. He claimed they had shown him visions of their origin, another world, and a reason for their secrecy. Skeptics dismissed it as imagination, the product of a man too deep in his own notes. Supporters pointed to the timing. His shutdown had been sudden, his behavior changed, and his warnings consistent in private letters to friends long before the book. What stood out, even to those who doubted the alien part, was the precision of the encounter. The men had arrived without names or ID. They had not argued, only instructed. And when Bender obeyed, they did not return. Over the years, the Bridgeport case became a key point in Men in Black research. Investigators noted the shared elements with later accounts: the black suits, the unnatural stillness of the room, the deep knowledge of the witness's activities, and the pressure to quit the subject. For Albert Bender, the encounters ended as suddenly as they had begun. He married, moved away, and left public UFO research. But the shadow of those visits, and the decision they forced, stayed with him. The IFSB had lasted just 2 years. Its end, and the silence that followed, left a gap in early UFO community history. The Bureau's members had been eager for the next stage of investigation. Instead, they were left with a single sentence: a solution found, a truth withheld, and an order obeyed. In the decades that followed, others would echo his story. Some described men who looked almost identical to one another, who appeared in pairs or threes, whose voices were flat, whose questions were already answers. Some were told to destroy photographs, others to hand over debris, others simply to forget. But in 1953, Albert Bender was among the first to face them and to stop completely. If the flying saucers were the mystery, the men were the consequence. And in case after case, the consequence returned, unannounced, unmoved, and already knowing what you had seen. Still with us, in the dark? Everyone, then you're braver than most. If these encounters have kept you here, leave a like. And if this is your first time walking these shadowed paths, subscribe, so the next strange night finds you again. Now, let's step back into the stories. Gray Barker's collected reports, 1950s to 1960s, Clarksburg, West Virginia, USA. After Albert K. Bender shut down the International Flying Saucer Bureau in 1953, the news sent a quiet shockwave through the small, close-knit UFO community. One of those paying attention was a young writer from West Virginia named Gray Barker. By day, he worked for a film distribution company. By night, often past midnight, he wrote down what he and many others saw as America's most puzzling mystery: the flying saucer phenomenon. Barker had never met Bender in person, but they had exchanged clippings and letters through the bureau, sharing accounts of sightings from their regions. When Bender's sudden silence came, Barker's curiosity grew sharper. Equal parts journalist and puzzle solver, he began pulling together notes, letters, and interviews, the first pages of what would become his collected reports. His first lead was a letter from one of Bender's old contacts, hinting that Bender had been persuaded in person to stop. Barker arranged to travel to Bridgeport in late autumn of 1953. The air was sharp with salt from Long Island Sound when he stepped off the train. Bender agreed to meet, but only in a hotel lobby, neutral ground. Barker arrived early. The dim light from the tall lamps pooled in yellow circles across the carpet. When Bender walked in, he looked thinner than in photographs, his eyes shadowed. They spoke for less than half an hour. Bender didn't name names. He didn't need to. Phrases like higher source and it's best to leave it alone carried the weight of something more than ordinary secrecy. Barker sensed there were things Bender wanted to say but wouldn't. They shook hands and parted. Barker turned toward the elevator to head up to his room. Halfway down the hallway, he realized he was no longer alone. A man stood ahead, still enough for his features to blur and shadow. Barker first thought it might be another guest until the man stepped into the yellow glow from a wall lamp. Black suit, white shirt, narrow tie, hat in his hand. The man didn't speak at first, only looked at Barker, then passed him as if measuring the space between them. The hallway felt unnaturally still. No voices from other rooms, no sound from the lobby below. Even the faint hum of the light fixtures seemed to fade. Barker nodded politely and moved to pass. The man didn't step aside. When Barker slowed, the man finally spoke, his voice flat and without any clear accent. "You won't get what you're looking for." It wasn't a question or a threat, more like an already settled fact. Before Barker could respond, the man stepped into the next corridor and vanished. When Barker followed a second later, the hall was empty. No door had closed. No footsteps echoed. Back in his room, Barker found the envelope holding his notes from the meeting. The flap was open, though he was sure he had closed it downstairs before heading up. In the years that followed, Barker kept collecting not just UFO reports, but also stories of silent visitors. Most came secondhand. Letters describing men who arrived in black cars, asked too many questions, or told witnesses to forget. Barker noticed the tone that ran through these reports. People weren't just describing meetings. They were trying to explain the disturbing sense that someone else had been guiding the conversation from the start. By the late 1950s, Barker was known in the UFO community as someone who didn't just gather stories. He saw patterns. So, when a report reached his desk in 1961 with unusually specific details, he decided to investigate in person. The letter came from Paul Henderson, a part-time radio technician living outside Parkersburg, West Virginia. Henderson claimed that after he reported a low-level disc sighting to a local newspaper, 2 men in black suits showed up at his home. They not only knew what he had told the paper, they knew the exact time he had gone outside, the direction he had been facing, and that he had taken a Polaroid photograph. Barker called the next day. Henderson sounded nervous, but agreed to meet if Barker came alone. The road to Henderson's house wound through low hills, bare winter trees rattling in the wind. When Barker arrived, the yard was empty except for an old sedan. Inside, Henderson fidgeted with the strap of his wristwatch as he retold the visit. The knock at the door just after sundown, the 2 men stepping inside without being invited. They never gave names. One briefly showed a card with lettering Henderson couldn't read before putting it away. They didn't ask for the photo, Henderson said. They told me I wouldn't find it worth keeping. Said it would fade, like it was nothing important. Barker asked to see it. Henderson opened a drawer, pulled out an envelope, and slid the photograph across the table. The image was pale, washed out, not from age, but as if the picture itself had been drained. A faint circular outline hovered over the trees, the rest nearly white. As Barker studied it, he realized the room had gone strangely quiet. The tick of the wall clock was the only sound. He glanced at the window. A black sedan idled at the far edge of the drive. 2 figures sat inside, faces turned toward the house. Barker looked back at Henderson, who had gone pale. "That's them," he said quietly. Without further talk, Barker gathered his notes, thanked Henderson, and left. By the time he stepped outside, the car was gone. Only the wind moved through the trees. The next morning, Barker found the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, the one holding Henderson's original letter, unlocked. He never left it that way. That was enough to confirm the pattern. A sighting is reported. A visit follows. The witness withdraws. Sometimes evidence disappears. Sometimes it is made meaningless. And always the visitors leave without names or proof, but with a parting line that weighs more than any clear threat. For Barker, these 2 encounters, one in a hotel hallway, one on a back road in West Virginia, showed that Bender's experience wasn't unique. The same stillness in the air, the same quieting of sound, the same pale faces and flat voices appeared again and again. In They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, Barker wove Bender's story together with others, creating what is often called the first public outline of the Men in Black. Critics accused him of exaggeration. Supporters argued he had mapped the edges of a deliberate effort to keep the UFO question unanswered. By the late 1960s, Barker knew he was no longer just an observer. He had been in the hallway, he had seen the car, and like the others, he understood the unspoken rule. Sightings are only part of the mystery. The visits are what follow. They didn't arrive with warning, and they never needed to explain themselves. You simply knew in that moment that your story was no longer yours alone. The Solway Firth Spaceman Photo, May 23, 1964, Burgh Marsh, Cumbria, England. On May 23, 1964, Jim Templeton, a fireman from Carlisle, took his wife Annie and their young daughter Elizabeth to Burgh Marsh near the Solway Firth. It was a quiet, open place, and he brought his camera to take a few family photos. He snapped 3 shots of Elizabeth as she sat on the grass in a light blue dress. 2 were ordinary. In the middle frame, however, a tall white figure appeared behind her, broad in the shoulders, with a smooth, rounded head. Neither Jim nor Annie had seen anyone in the area. The marsh was empty, and it would have been impossible for someone to walk in and vanish unnoticed. When the film was developed, the figure was undeniable. Friends urged him to take it to the police. They saw nothing suspicious in the negative and sent him to Kodak. who confirmed it was a single, untouched exposure. A local paper published the image, calling it the Solway Firth Spaceman. It made national headlines, and Templeton found himself answering questions from journalists. He had no theories, only the photograph. That was when two men came to see him. They arrived without warning at the Carlisle fire station where Templeton worked. They wore dark suits, white shirts, and narrow ties. Both were tall, clean-shaven, and spoke with an accent Templeton couldn't place. They introduced themselves only as Number 9 and Number 11. No names, no business cards. They said they were from the government, but never said which part. Their manner was polite, but strangely formal, almost rehearsed. The men asked Templeton to go with them back to Burgh Marsh. He agreed, and they drove together in a dark sedan, the two men in the front, Templeton in the back. On the way, they spoke very little, asking only whether he still had the negatives and whether he had shown them to anyone else. Once at the marsh, the questions became more detailed. They asked about the weather, the direction of the wind, and whether there had been any planes overhead that day. They wanted to know exactly where he had been standing, which way he was facing, and whether he had noticed anything unusual, sounds, smells, sudden changes in temperature. Templeton repeated what he had told the police and Kodak. The afternoon had been calm and uneventful. No one else had been nearby, and nothing strange had been visible at the time. The men listened, but their expressions didn't change. One of them asked again whether Templeton was sure he hadn't seen anyone, even at a distance. Then came a question that unsettled him. Did he believe the figure was connected to anything he might have read about in the news? Templeton said he didn't know. The man pressed. Was he holding something back? Templeton denied it. The tone shifted. The two men exchanged a quick glance, ended the questioning, and told Templeton the matter was best forgotten. Without another word, they walked back to their car and drove off, leaving him standing on the marsh. He never saw them again. The visit stayed with him. Their refusal to give names, the way they referred to each other by numbers, and their suggestion that he forget the whole thing left him uneasy. In later interviews, he would say that the men seemed less interested in the photograph itself than in what he thought about it, and maybe how much he was ready to say publicly. Not long after, he received a call from an Australian reporter claiming that figures resembling the one in his photograph had been seen at the Woomera test range during a missile launch. The figures, reportedly in white and helmeted, had been spotted inside a restricted area, causing a test to be delayed. The reporter said photographs existed, though none were ever released. Templeton was struck by the timing. The Woomera incident was said to have happened within days of his photograph, but he could never confirm the claim. The Australian government refused to comment, and British authorities gave no information. If any official link existed between the two events, it stayed hidden. The story, fueled by the photograph's publication, continued to spread. Skeptics argued that the spaceman could have been Annie Templeton stepping briefly into the frame, her dress overexposed by bright sunlight to appear white. Believers countered that the figure was taller and broader than Annie, and that the helmet-like head and stiff stance didn't match her posture or build. Templeton and Annie both insisted she had been several yards away at the time. As the years passed, Templeton noticed that the interest from officials, or people claiming to be officials, had not fully gone away. A few months after the visit to the marsh, he was approached by another pair of men in suits, this time at his home. They asked similar questions, though in a less formal tone. He suspected they were connected to the first two visitors, But these men identified themselves only as investigators and said nothing about where they were from. Their questions again circled around his memory of the day and whether he had seen or heard anything unusual. He also received letters from people who claimed to have seen similar figures in remote areas, often near military sites or testing grounds. Some wrote that they had later been questioned by unknown men. Templeton began to wonder if his experience was part of a larger pattern. By the 1970s, the photograph had appeared in books and television programs about unexplained events. The men in dark suits were often mentioned alongside it, compared to other cases where witnesses to strange events reported visits from mysterious officials. In UFO research circles, such reports were grouped under the label "Men in Black." Though Templeton himself rarely used the term, he stuck to the facts as he experienced them. Two unknown men, formal in dress and manner, who arrived without explanation, questioned him in detail, and told him to forget what he had seen. Speculation about who they were ranged from intelligence officers to private contractors working for defense agencies. The fact that Berg Marsh was close to military testing ranges in the UK, and the mention of Woomera gave weight to theories that their interest was not about aliens, but about something captured in the background, equipment, staff, or a test that should not have been photographed. Others, leaning toward the paranormal, saw the figures as part of an effort to hide sightings of unexplained beings. Templeton always said he had nothing to hide and nothing to gain by making up the story. He never sold the negative, refused offers of payment for exclusive rights, and only allowed copies to be made for analysis. He often admitted the photograph had disrupted his life, but he never backed away from his story of the marsh or the strange men who questioned him. Even decades later, the Solway case was still cited as one of the more interesting overlaps between photographic evidence and unexplained official interest. Analysts who studied the negative agreed it was genuine and untouched. What they argued over was the figure itself and the reason for the visits. If it was a person, who were they? And why were they there? And if it wasn't connected to anything earthly, why had Templeton been told to forget it? The case still sits in a gray area, neither fully disproved nor fully confirmed. For those interested in photographic mysteries, it remains a rare example of an image that held up under technical study, yet brought its photographer into contact with people whose identity and purpose were never made clear. For those drawn to the lore of unexplained encounters, it stands as a reminder that sometimes the most troubling questions are not about what appears in a photograph, but about who comes asking afterward. The Point Pleasant Mothman Wave. November 1966, December 1967. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, USA. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in late 1966 was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's names. Daily talk was about the weather, the Ohio River's levels, or the Friday football game. That changed in November when a few people claimed to have seen something large and winged near the old munition storage grounds north of town, a place locals simply called the TNT area. Those sightings made the local paper. But what happened afterward left a deeper mark. The people who had spoken up, farmers, shopkeepers, young couples, a school teacher, began to get visits. The strangers who came were polite but unsettling, always in dark suits, arriving without warning and rarely giving names. What they wanted was unclear, but it was obvious they were after more than just statements. Mary Heyer, the Athens Messenger's Point Pleasant correspondent, became the center for sighting reports. She was used to covering floods or county fairs. But soon her office filled with people reporting strange events, a shadow moving low over a barn roof, red lights drifting across the river, a figure on a roadside. She took notes, wrote her column Where the Waters Mingle, and filed the clippings in her desk. That's when the other kind of visits began. One of the first came to a farmer outside town who had told Heyer he saw the winged figure in his pasture at dusk. Days later, a black sedan pulled up the long gravel lane to his house. Two men stepped out, tall, in dark coats and hats. They asked if they could go over his account. They started off just asking what I'd already told Mary, he said years later. Then they got real specific. Wanted to know if I'd told anyone else, if I'd written it down. When I asked who they were, one of them smiled and said, "That's not important." The conversation ended with a line he never forgot. Things are less complicated if they're left alone. What unsettled him most wasn't the warning. It was the feeling they already knew his answers before he spoke. Another visit came to a woman who had reported strange lights moving low over the Ohio River. Two men came to her door after dark, their car idling outside. They were polite, she said. Not scary, just cold, like they'd practiced being nice. They asked where she'd been standing, which direction she'd been looking, and whether she could draw the light's path. She recalled they never wrote anything down, but repeated her answers back to her word for word. When she looked outside a minute after they left, the street was empty. She hadn't heard the car leave. Heyer herself experienced something similar. The first signs were silent phone calls that stayed open for half a minute, sometimes broken by an electronic beep before disconnecting. Then one afternoon, a man walked into her office. She later described him as short, with long black hair, pale skin, and an oddly stiff posture. He didn't waste time with introductions. Heyer told another reporter. He asked about the articles I'd written on the sightings, then suddenly switched to city lights, wanted to know the colors, whether they were regular. I told him what I could, and he just walked out without another word. By January 1967, Heyer's desk drawers held not just sighting reports, but also visitor accounts. A teenage witness told her about an old model black sedan that had pulled up outside his house. Two men in matching coats wanted to go over his sighting again. They started dropping in things they shouldn't know, he said. The name of my dog, where my sister worked, my mom's birthday. They didn't ask, they told me, like they were checking if they were right. In town, a hardware store owner had his own encounter. He mentioned to friends that he'd seen a figure on his roof one night. A week later, two men came into his store while he was closing. They didn't say who they were with, just started asking about my deliveries, what trucks came, what time, if anything unusual had been dropped off. It didn't have much to do with what I saw. They left without buying a thing. Other events were less direct, but no less strange. A shop assistant who had given Heyer a written statement about seeing red lights over the river found her statement missing from her desk at home, the folder left open. A mechanic, interviewed by two strangers, later noticed the same car parked near his garage 3 nights in a row, never moving in daylight. While none of these visitors claimed to represent a specific agency, their manner carried an air of officialdom. Formal dress, clipped speech, controlled body language. Some assumed they were government investigators. Others weren't sure. Local law enforcement quietly admitted the visits were happening. A county deputy told Heyer some of his own witnesses had been questioned before he could reach them. "I don't know who they were," he said, "but they weren't ours." A state trooper recalled seeing a dark sedan with out-of-state plates parked near the TNT area one night, its engine running, but no one visible inside. As 1967 went on, The visits seemed less about collecting facts and more about shaping what people would say. Witnesses described clear pressure not to talk to reporters or to change details. "They told me flat out I was mistaken," one recalled. "I told them I knew what I saw, and they just kept shaking their heads like I was a child." The effect was real. Several witnesses pulled out of public discussion. A young couple, who had been among the first to report the winged figure, stopped answering calls unless they knew who it was. "We didn't want to deal with it anymore," the husband said decades later. "It wasn't worth the looks you'd get in town or the knocks on the door." A retired railroad worker who had given a detailed description of a nighttime encounter stopped talking even with friends. "Didn't need the trouble," he told Hire. In December 1967, the visits seemed to increase. More than one witness remembered being questioned again just before the Silver Bridge collapsed on the 15th, killing 46 people in the icy Ohio River. In some cases, the questions were directly about the bridge, its traffic, the times people crossed, without explanation. After the collapse, the winged figure sightings stopped. So did most of the visits, though some people later got calls asking if they'd noticed anything else unusual since the disaster. For many, the end of the sightings didn't bring relief. Instead, it left unanswered questions about why they had been targeted and by whom. Hire kept her files until her death in 1970. When researchers later examined them, they found sighting reports and visitor accounts mixed together, often on the same page. Over 13 months, Point Pleasant had not just a wave of strange aerial reports, but also a quieter campaign of direct contact with those who spoke up. Speculation about who the visitors were has continued ever since. Some think they were federal agents working secretly, though no agency has ever claimed responsibility. Others think they were private contractors for defense or intelligence groups. More far-reaching theories suggest they weren't tied to any known organization at all. What stands out is the consistency of the accounts. Dark cars on rural roads, pairs of men in near-identical clothing, formal speech, precise questioning, no names given, and a sense they knew more than they admitted. Whether their purpose was to gather information, silence witnesses, or simply monitor stories, they left behind the same lasting impression that someone was paying close attention. Today, Point Pleasant's place in Men in Black lore rivals more famous UFO cases. The winged figure made the headlines, but for many who lived through it, the real mystery was the knock on the door afterward. Thank you for walking these shadows with us tonight. The Men in Black, always close, never gone. Are they watching you right now? We may never know, but the stories remain. Until next time, keep your eyes on the sky, your door locked, and your mind open to dreams of disclosure.